I didn't think much about the job when I first got it, just another dead-end gig to keep the lights on. The ad had been simple. Hiring night shift, no experience required, cash daily. Sounded perfect. I was broke, desperate, and willing to take anything that paid under the table. When I called, the manager, a guy named Tom, told me to come in that same night. No interview, no paperwork, just show up at 10 p.m. and don't be late. Weird, sure, but I needed the money. The Babby wasn't like other diners. For one, it was too quiet. Even with music playing softly from the jukebox, there was this eerie silence that clung to the place, like the walls were swallowing sound. It sat alone on a stretch of highway, a flickering neon, open 24 hours sign buzzing in the dark, no other buildings for miles, just an endless road and the occasional set of headlights passing in the night. Inside, the booths were cracked red leather, the walls covered in old-timey framed photos, black and white pictures of people who'd probably eaten here long before I was born. Some of the faces looked off, too sharp, too hollow, but I figured it was just the poor lighting. A long counter stretched across the room, complete with those classic spinning stools. Behind it was the open kitchen, flat-top grill, deep fryers, a rusting coffee machine. A single door in the back led to the walk-in fridge, a break room, and the manager's office. The only thing that stood out was the red booth in the far corner. Unlike the others, this one wasn't cracked or faded. It looked brand new. Something about it made my skin crawl, but I couldn't say why. Tom was waiting for me behind the counter when I walked in. He was an older guy, maybe mid-50s, with a tired face and a cigarette burning between his fingers. "You showed up. Good. Not many do. You know. That was my first warning sign. But by then it was already too late. Tom didn't bother with small talk. Instead, he led me into the break room, a cramped space with a table, 2 chairs, and a boxy old TV set sitting on a metal cart. "Watch this," he said, pulling a VHS tape from the cabinet. The label had been scratched off. I let out a short laugh. "This, some kind of orientation?" Tom didn't answer. He shoved the tape into the VCR and pressed play. The screen flickered. Static. Then, a dimly lit diner, the same one I was standing in. The video was grainy, like it had been recorded decades ago. A monotone voice spoke over the footage.
"Welcome to Babby Diner. As a night shift employee, you must follow the rules carefully. These are not suggestions."
I frowned. Weird way to train new employees. Then the voice started listing the rules. The footage cut between different parts of the diner. Empty booths, the silent kitchen, the parking lot beyond the glass doors.
Rule number 1. From 3:07 a.m. to 3:33 a.m., lock the doors, turn off the lights, and stay behind the counter. Do not check security cameras. Do not respond to knocking. Rule number 2. If a man in a gray suit sits in the red booth, serve him immediately. Do not engage in conversation. Do not sit in that booth yourself. Rule number 3. If a receipt prints before the order is placed, deliver the meal to table 6. The customer will arrive shortly. Do not react. Rule number 4. If a customer orders black coffee, no sugar, use the chipped mug from the back. If you serve it in a different mug, leave the diner before they take their first sip. Rule number 5. If the jukebox plays a song you don't recognize, put a $5 bill in and select Folsom Prison Blues. Do not let the unknown song finish. Rule number 6. If a man with a bleeding forehead asks where she went, lie. Tell him she went the other way. Do not let him stay longer than 2 minutes. Rule number 7. If the payphone rings, answer it on the first ring. Do not speak first. Listen carefully. When the caller hangs up, unplug the phone for exactly 3 minutes. Rule number 8. Do not, under any circumstances, look directly at the security camera feed between 3:15 a.m. and 3:17 a.m.
And then, the last rule. The footage glitched violently, static tearing across the screen. For a second I thought I saw something else, something I couldn't even try to describe.
Rule number 9. If you ever find yourself alone in the diner when you shouldn't be, check the clock. If it reads July 8th, 2099, go to the walk-in freezer immediately and lock the door behind you. If you see a closed version of yourself, do not leave, no matter what you hear, no matter how long it takes.
The video stopped. I sat there staring at the blank screen. Tom exhaled smoke. Still think it's a joke? I swallowed hard. I didn't, but I needed the money. So I nodded. Yeah, I'm in. Tom just nodded. Good. Your shift starts now. He left me alone at the counter while he disappeared into the back office. For the first hour, everything was normal. I served coffee to a couple of truckers, flipped a few burgers, wiped down the counter. Easy stuff. At one point, the printer spat out an order that no one placed, but before I could ask, Tom's voice came from the office. Make the steak. Put it in the fridge. A chill ran down my spine. I went to the grill and started cooking. But as I carried the plate to the walk-in fridge, I swear I felt something watching me. Then, as I shut the fridge door, the lights flickered. Once, twice. Tom's voice, urgent. Kitchen. Now. I ran. And then I heard the knocking. The knocking wouldn't stop. It started soft, just a few raps against the glass, but after a few seconds, it turned urgent, fists slamming against the front doors, shaking them in their frames. I pressed myself against the counter, heart pounding. The lights were off, the doors were locked, and I was hidden behind the register, just like the tape had instructed. Rule number 1, from 3:07 a.m. to 3:33 a.m., lock the doors, turn off the lights, and stay behind the counter. Do not check security cameras, do not respond to knocking. It was exactly 3:09 a.m. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to drown out the sound. This is just a prank. It has to be a prank. But then came the voice. Hey man, open up. I need help. A chill ran down my spine. It wasn't muffled, like someone speaking through glass. It was clear, too close, too crisp. As if the voice was right next to my ear, I clenched my jaw and stayed put. The banging continued for another 2 minutes, then just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Silence. I counted the seconds in my head. 3 minutes passed. Then 5. At 3:33 a.m., the jukebox flickered back to life, playing a low, warbling tune I didn't recognize. The lights overhead buzzed and snapped back on. I exhaled sharply. Rule number 1 had been tested. And I'd passed. But I had no time to feel relieved, because at 3:34 a.m., the front door chimed. Someone had walked in. I turned my head slowly, pulse hammering. There he was. A tall man in a gray suit sitting in the red booth. His posture was rigid, hands folded neatly on the table. His face was pale, almost colorless, and his eyes were hidden behind a pair of dark sunglasses. Something about him was wrong, like an old photograph that had been overexposed, just slightly too sharp, too crisp for reality. Rule number 2 flashed in my mind. If a man in a gray suit sits in the red booth, serve him immediately. Do not engage in conversation. Do not sit in that booth yourself. I should have moved. I should have grabbed the coffee pot, poured him a cup, and set it down in front of him without a word. But I didn't. I just stood there staring at him, my feet glued to the floor. And that's when he turned his head toward me. Even though his sunglasses covered his eyes, I could feel his gaze drilling into me. "Is there a problem?" he asked. His voice was smooth, polite, but hollow, like a radio transmission playing back from miles away. My throat went dry. The temperature in the diner dropped. The air thickened. And in that moment I knew. I had just broken the rule. The man in gray tilted his head slightly. The corners of his mouth twitched, like he was about to smile. Something inside me screamed. I snapped out of it. Grabbing the coffee pot with shaking hands, I rushed toward his table, poured a cup, and slid it in front of him without another word. For a long, excruciating second, he didn't move. Then, slowly, he reached for the cup. The moment his fingers wrapped around the handle, the air shifted back to normal. The diner felt lighter, warmer. I backed away, forcing myself not to run. Tom's office door creaked open behind me. He stepped out, took one look at the red booth, then at me. His eyes narrowed slightly. "Don't let that happen again," he muttered before disappearing back inside. I turned back to the booth. The man in the gray suit was gone. The coffee cup sat untouched, and beneath it, resting on the table, was a single black business card. No name, no number. Just 3 words printed in tiny silver font. "See you soon."
Black coffee,
she said.
no sugar.
My stomach dropped. Rule number 4. If a customer orders black coffee, no sugar, use the chipped mug from the back. If you serve it in a different mug, leave the diner before they take their first sip. I swallowed hard. Coming right up. My hands shook as I moved to the back shelf. I scanned dozens of mugs, plain white, checkered, floral. But then I saw it. A simple black mug, chipped on the rim. I grabbed it, poured the coffee, and set it in front of her. She stared at it for a long time. Then she exhaled sharply.
Smart kid.
She muttered. She picked up the mug and took a sip. Nothing happened. No flickering lights. No eerie whispers. No wrongness pressing in from all sides. The woman set the mug down and looked up at me.
First night?
I nodded, my throat too dry to speak. She smirked.
Better than most.
And then she pulled a crumpled receipt from her pocket. I didn't look at it. I don't know why, but I knew I shouldn't. She slid it across the counter, tapping it once.
When the time comes, you'll know.
I didn't move. She pushed back from the counter, grabbed her purse, and walked out the door. I stared at the receipt. It was faded, old, like it had been printed decades ago. And at the bottom in smudged ink, there was a date, July 8th, 2099. The receipt from the old woman stayed in my pocket all night. I tried not to think about it, tried not to focus on the faded ink, the impossible date, the way she looked at me like she knew something I didn't. But it was there. A weight in my pocket, a reminder that this diner wasn't just a job. It was something else. I told myself I'd throw it away before my shift ended. I didn't. It was a slow night. Too slow. I wiped down the counter for the third time. The red booths were empty. The neon sign buzzed outside, flickering like it was struggling to stay alive. Then, the jukebox turned on. A single distorted note rang through the diner. Low. Off key. I frowned. No one had touched the jukebox. And the sound that followed wasn't music. It was wrong. The closest thing I can compare it to is a warped vinyl record played backward with someone humming underneath it. Ma'o'in. Not quite human, not quite a melody. The air in the diner shifted. My stomach twisted. Rule number 5 slammed into my mind. If the jukebox plays a song you don't recognize, put a $5 bill in and select Folsom Prison Blues. Do not let the unknown song finish. I didn't waste time. I dug into my apron pocket, fingers shaking as I fished out a crumpled $5 bill. The jukebox's glow flickered. The song warped. I ran. Slamming the bill into the slot, I stabbed the buttons until I saw it. Folsom Prison Blues. The instant I pressed it, the unknown song cut off. A breathless pause. Then, Johnny Cash's voice filled the diner. Warm, familiar, safe. The air lightened. I leaned against the jukebox, heart hammering. From behind the counter, Tom's office door creaked open. Quick reflexes, he muttered, before shutting himself inside again. I exhaled. The jukebox hummed along as if nothing had ever been wrong, but I knew better. I'd almost heard something I wasn't supposed to hear. The diner stayed quiet after that. I let myself believe the worst was over, that maybe, just maybe, I'd get a normal shift for once. Then at 4:21 a.m., the door swung open, and he walked in. A tall, thin man, pale as death, and running down the center of his forehead. A deep, jagged gash. Blood dripped down his nose, past his cheekbones, soaking the collar of his button-up shirt. He moved slowly, like he didn't feel it. Like he didn't even notice he was bleeding. I didn't breathe. Because I knew. Rule number 6. If a man with a bleeding forehead asks where she went, lie. Tell him she went the other way. Do not let him stay longer than 2 minutes. The man reached the counter. He didn't sit down. He didn't even blink. He just stared at me. Did you see a woman? He asked. His voice was flat, cold. She was just here. I need to find her. My throat went dry. The correct answer was obvious. I should have answered immediately. Should have lied. Should have pointed outside, away from the diner, and sent him in the opposite direction. But I hesitated, and that was a mistake. His fingers twitched, his jaw tightened. Did you see her? He repeated, a little too sharp this time. The lights flickered. The air grew thick. My instincts screamed. Yeah, I forced out, finally finding my voice. She ran that way. I pointed toward the back alley. His head twitched slightly, like he was listening to something I couldn't hear. Then, without another word, he turned. He walked out the door. And just like that, the diner snapped back to normal. But I stood there, frozen, because I had the horrible, gut-wrenching feeling that if I had answered wrong, if I had told him anything other than a lie, I wouldn't be standing here at all. I didn't realize my hands were shaking until I reached for the rag to wipe the counter. I felt sick. This place, this diner, it wasn't just haunted. It wasn't just cursed. It was something else, something worse. And somehow, I was part of it now. I took a breath and reached into my pocket. The old woman's receipt was still there. I hesitated. Then for the first time I unfolded it and read the whole thing. It wasn't just a date. There was a time, too. July 8th, 2099, 3:33 a.m. The exact time I had locked the doors and followed rule number 1. My stomach dropped. I looked up at the diner's neon clock. It read 4:46 a.m. I swallowed hard. For a second, just a second, the neon flickered, and the numbers warped. 2099. I blinked. The numbers snapped back to normal. I let out a shaky breath and crumpled the receipt back into my pocket. I didn't know what was coming, but I had a feeling I wasn't ready for it. In Naintown, by my 4th shift, I should have been used to the diner's horrors. I wasn't. Not after table 6. Not after the jukebox song that wasn't music. Not after the man with the bleeding forehead. But for some reason, tonight felt different. The air was heavier. The neon sign outside buzzed in a low, sickly hum. And when I stepped behind the counter and glanced at the security camera feed, the screen glitched for half a second. A single frame. Someone was standing in the back alley. Tall, unmoving, watching the diner. And then the screen flickered, and the figure was gone. The shift started quiet. A few regulars drifted in and out. The coffee pot hissed softly in the background. Then, the old payphone in the corner jolted my nerves. The sound sliced through the diner like a blade. I nearly ignored it. Then I remembered, rule number 7. If the payphone rings, answer it on the first ring. Do not speak first. Listen carefully. When the caller hangs up, unplug the phone for exactly 3 minutes. I lunged for the receiver and snatched it up before the second ring finished. The line was dead silent. A chill ran through me, and then a voice. Software shaky, distant. Do not turn around. My spine locked up. My breathing hitched. The voice was faint, like it was coming from far away, but I could hear it clearly. He's watching you. The diner felt too quiet. I stared straight ahead, muscles tight with fear. The air behind me shifted. He's closer now, the voice whispered. A prickle of terror crawled up my neck. I gripped the receiver tighter. Don't move. Silence. And then, the line cut off. I dropped the phone like it burned me. I didn't dare move for a full minute. Then with shaking hands, I reached down and yanked the payphone cord out of the wall. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3. The air eased. I finally turned. The diner was empty. But outside, under the buzzing neon sign, a shadow stood just beyond the streetlights. Not moving, not leaving, watching. I tried to shake off the feeling, but the shift dragged on. Then, at exactly 3:14 a.m., the security monitors flickered. My pulse spiked. Rule number 8. Do not, under any circumstances, look directly at the security camera feed between 3:15 a.m. and 3:17 a.m. I knew better. I should have walked away. But something about the screen felt odd. The usual grainy black and white feed seemed off. The diner looked different. I couldn't help myself. I glanced at the clock. 3:14 a.m. I had a few seconds, just one peek. I looked, and I regretted it instantly because the cameras weren't showing the diner anymore. They were showing something else. A dark, endless void. And in the middle of that void, a person. Number not a person. Something wearing a person. It stood in the exact center of the frame, staring at the camera. Its face was stretched, distorted, like someone had tried to press human skin over the wrong shape. Its eyes locked onto mine, and then it moved. Not on the screen. Behind me. I felt it. The air plummeted to freezing. The sound in the diner vanished, and then something breathed against my ear. I couldn't move. I was dead. I was already dead. I broke rule number 8. And then the miracle happened. The jukebox clicked on. A new song played, a familiar one, Folsom Prison Blues. The air snapped back to normal. The security monitor glitched, and just like that, the presence was gone. I gasped for air. My lungs burned. I turned slowly to look behind me. Nothing. But I knew it had been there. And worse, it knew me now. I wasn't just working in the diner anymore. Something in the diner was watching me, and it was waiting. The night felt different. Not in the usual way, where the air felt heavy or the lights flickered. Number tonight felt like the calm before the storm, the silence that settles right before everything falls apart. The diner was empty for the most part, just a few quiet souls. Regulars, I thought. The kind of people who are always there, no matter the time. I stood behind the counter, eyes flicking to the clock. 3:13 a.m. I was aware of the tension in the air, like I could feel the clock ticking louder. The usual hum of the neon sign outside seemed to buzz more aggressively. I tried to distract myself by wiping down the counter, but my mind kept drifting to the rules. Rule number 9. I had avoided looking at the clock for most of the night, but tonight something felt off. I shouldn't have looked. 3:15 a.m. I froze. The diner was eerily quiet, save for the faint sound of the coffee pot hissing in the back. And then, as if in slow motion, the second hand ticked forward, and something caught my eye. The clock. The hands. They stopped. At 3:15 a.m., I blinked. Something wasn't right. But before I could react, the clock changed. The hands jumped forward, and for a brief second, just a fraction of a moment, I saw it. July 8th, 2099. The date burned into my mind. A sickening chill swept through me. I knew what I had to do. Without a second thought, I bolted toward the freezer. I didn't hesitate. I didn't care about anything else. I slammed the door behind me, locking it. The cold air rushed over me, and for a moment, I thought I might actually feel safe. The knock at the door would have to wait. But then it came. The knocking. Faint at first, like a distant tapping, then growing louder. It was as if something or someone was trying to get in. I didn't move. I couldn't. All I could think of was the clock. July 8th, 2099. I had followed the rule. I had done exactly what I was supposed to. And yet, the knocking continued. Louder now, each tap a reminder of what could be waiting on the other side. I couldn't risk it. Not for a second. I hugged the back wall of the freezer, hoping that maybe, just maybe, I had made it in time. I didn't hear it at first, the sound of the doorbell, but when I finally dared to peek through the slats of the freezer door, the hair on the back of my neck stood up. There, outside the diner, was me, a perfect replica. It didn't speak, it didn't move, just stood there, staring at me through the glass. I thought I might be dreaming, but I wasn't. I could feel it. The eyes, it knew me. It wasn't me, but it looked like me. It was me, but it wasn't. I backed away, unable to tear my eyes off it. I could hear its breathing now. Software, almost like it was waiting for something. I closed my eyes, desperately willing it to go away. Please, don't let it come inside. I held my breath, hoping that when I opened my eyes, it would be gone. I heard the door swing open. My heart stopped. It wasn't supposed to open, but there it was, the doppelganger still standing outside staring at me with that unsettling gaze. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. Gone. I slowly inched toward the freezer door, peering through the cracks. Outside, the street was empty. The only thing I saw was the neon glow of the sign above the diner. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. It was over. For now. But I knew deep down that whatever I had just witnessed, it wasn't over. The freezer was cold, but oddly comforting. I didn't know how long I'd been huddled in there, but the world outside felt like it had slipped away. The knocking had stopped. The strange figure, my doppelganger, was gone. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Something had shifted in the air. It was thick, heavy with unspoken words, waiting to collapse on me. I hesitated before opening the freezer door. The room beyond felt still. I pulled the door open slowly, peering out into the dim diner. The clock above the counter was normal again, no sign of the horrible date from before. July 8th, 2099 had disappeared. The diner was quiet. Too quiet. I cautiously walked out of the freezer and made my way to a booth by the far window. The lights flickered above me, casting eerie shadows on the walls. I didn't care anymore. I needed to sit. To think. I slid into a booth, the vinyl seat sticky under my fingertips. I was still trembling, but I needed to calm down. It had been the right move. I knew that. I'd followed the rule. I was safe. For now. I tried to focus on the hum of the diner's neon lights, the quiet hiss of the coffee pot. The regulars were still here, but something felt off. I felt eyes on me. The door opened with a soft jingle and a man stepped in. He looked around the diner, disoriented, like he'd just woken up from a bad dream. He scanned the room, his eyes lingering on me before he made his way to the counter. He sat down a few stools away and ordered coffee without saying much. I didn't know why, but something about him made me uneasy. Maybe it was the way he kept glancing at me. Or maybe it was the fact that his presence felt oddly familiar, like I had seen him before. The man glanced at me again, his eyes narrowing as if something about me triggered a memory. His gaze flicked to the booth next to mine before he turned back to me. It happened so quickly I almost didn't process it at first. He stood up, took a few steps toward my booth. "Hey," he said, his voice low. I wasn't sure why, but something in the way he spoke sent a chill through me. I swallowed hard. "I was told not to sit here," he continued, his eyes glancing nervously at the booth beside me. "But I thought you'd be okay with it." I blinked at him. For a split second I didn't recognize him, but then, like a floodgate opening, I remembered rule number 2. I had seen him before, the man who never sat next to anyone, the man who always waited for someone to leave, the same guy who would break rule number 2 just to sit with someone, rule number 2. Never let anyone sit with you until they've been seated at the booth. It was a simple rule, one that felt almost silly at first, but now I knew better. I had seen this man's type before. He was the one who would always wander into the diner at the wrong time, breaking the smallest of rules, yet somehow managing to be completely unaware of what he was doing. I had to follow the rule, but it felt off. Something was wrong. I tried to ignore it. I tried to shake it off, but I couldn't. The man stood there, his hands clenched by his side. He wasn't waiting for a response. I didn't want to break the rule, but it felt like I had no choice. Before I could say anything, the man slid into the booth beside me. He settled in like it was the most natural thing in the world. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze. I had broken rule number 2, but he didn't seem to care. There we were, 2 people who had both broken rules in the same diner on the same night, and for some reason it felt like the world had tilted just slightly off its axis. I tried not so and soren lukerad or kisor gyok at imate at him, but the man sitting across from me, the one who'd just broken rule number 2, kept staring. His eyes never left me, and for a second I thought I might just get up and leave. I didn't know what to make of him anymore. He was just there. But then he did something that shattered whatever semblance of normalcy I had left. Without a word, the man reached up to his neck, his fingers gently grazing his skin. I thought he was scratching an itch or doing something strange, but I was wrong. In one swift motion, he pulled his own head off. I froze. It wasn't a trick. It wasn't a joke. The man cut his head off, just like that, in front of me. The blood sprayed across the table, splattering onto the booth, dripping down onto the floor. But the strangest thing was how calm he looked, how detached he was. Like this was something he'd done 100 times before. The moment his head hit the table, I felt a cold rush of dread. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. And then it happened. The blood on the table shifted. It swirled in an eerie, unnatural motion. The man's head started to grow back. It wasn't like a human wound healing. It was more like something unnatural was putting him together. The blood began to move and reassemble into his body, the skin knitting itself back together until, just like that, he had his head back, perfectly intact. He blinked a few times as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't just severed his own head. "Better?" he asked, his voice a little off, but still somehow familiar. I couldn't answer. My heart pounded in my chest. The blood on the table was still warm, and I could feel my pulse racing. This wasn't possible. This wasn't real. But the man didn't seem to care. He got up from the booth, wiped the blood from his shirt as if it was nothing, and headed for the door. As he left, he turned back and shot me a strange smile. It wasn't a pleasant smile. It was a knowing smile. I sat there for what felt like hours. I couldn't focus on the hum of the diner or the low murmur of the other customers. I couldn't even look at the clock. It was like time had stopped. When the man left, the diner felt quieter somehow. Empty. I knew my shift was over. I couldn't stay here anymore. I stood up shakily, wiping the sweat off my palms onto my apron. My body felt numb, like I was moving on autopilot. I walked to the back, grabbed my jacket, and headed for the exit. I was done. I swore to myself. I was never coming back. Just as I reached the door, I heard a familiar voice. "Leaving already?" It was the boss. He was leaning against the counter, arms crossed, watching me. His eyes glinted in the dim light. I can't do this anymore," I muttered, my voice barely a whisper. "I saw it. I saw what he did. I'm done." The boss didn't seem fazed. He just smiled, a wide grin that didn't reach his eyes. "I get it," he said, almost too calmly. "I really do. But before you leave..." He reached into his pocket, pulling out an envelope and sliding it across the counter. I stared at it. My gut twisted. "What's this?" I asked, a little hesitant. "It's an offer." The boss's smile widened. $40 an hour, all the hours you want, all the shifts you can take. You won't find a better offer anywhere else. Trust me." I couldn't breathe. I could feel the weight of his words pressing down on me. I'd been working for far less than that, scraping by, living paycheck to paycheck. $40 an hour? I was tempted. Number I couldn't. But before I could walk away, the boss spoke again. "You've seen things here, haven't you? Things most people never will. You can't leave now. You're the only person who can survive nights at this diner, besides me." The words haunted me. I could feel my heart racing in my chest. I wanted to leave so badly to escape this nightmare, but the offer was there, staring me in the face. I stood frozen. $40 an hour, he repeated, as if he knew I couldn't say no. "And you're free to leave whenever you want, but you'll always come back." I sat there, staring at the blood-streaked table, my heart hammering in my chest. That man had just cut off his own head, and then it grew back, like nothing had happened. No one reacted, no one screamed. It was like it was normal, and just like that, he got up and walked out the door, leaving me sitting there, frozen, questioning every single choice that had led me here. The diner was silent again. I could hear the faint hum of the overhead lights. My shift was over. I needed to leave. I pushed myself up from the booth, legs shaky, my mind still trying to process what I had seen. I was done. I was never coming back. I made it as far as the back room, where I threw my apron onto the hook and grabbed my jacket. My hands were still shaking. I took a deep breath, telling myself I'd walk out that door, go home, and forget this place existed. Then the boss walked in. He was leaning against the doorway, arms crossed, watching me with the same calm expression he always had. "Leaving?" he asked. I scoffed. "Yeah, I quit." He didn't look surprised. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the envelope again. $40 an hour, he said. I almost laughed. 40 an hour? That was more than double what I was making. I stared at the envelope, then at him. "You could offer me 1,000 an hour, and I'd still walk." The boss raised an eyebrow. "You sure?" I didn't answer right away, because that's when the reality hit me. I had nowhere else to go. My rent was overdue. My fridge was empty. And the only thing waiting for me at home was more stress, more job applications that would never get a response. 40 an hour. That was life-changing. I exhaled sharply, looking away. "It's not about the money?" I muttered. "Then what's it about?" I opened my mouth, then shut it, because I didn't actually know. The rules, the customers, the things I had seen, all of it. The boss watched me, waiting. He didn't need to say anything else, because we both knew the truth. I'd be back. I hated it. I hated myself for even considering it, for standing here thinking it over instead of just walking out that door. I grabbed the envelope. I start tomorrow at midnight, I said. The boss grinned, like that was the answer he expected all along. Good choice. I turned and walked out of the diner, feeling the cold air rush over me. I stood there for a moment, staring out at the empty parking lot, clutching that envelope in my hand. I shouldn't have taken it, I shouldn't be coming back, but I was, and that terrified me more than anything else.